again. I think we're going to get this show on the road. So, hi everyone. My name is Dave Ryan. I'm on the WordPress core team at Bluehost. So I spend about 80% of my time contributing to the WordPress open source project, and about 20% of my time working on Bluehost systems. I guess worth mentioning, because it's something we'll talk about a little bit here. Before I was at Bluehost, I was working at Time Inc. That was where I actually first got exposed to using headless WordPress. So Time Inc., now Meredith Corporation, is the largest magazine company in the world. They have 120 brands, things like Time.com, People.com, tons of cooking magazines, all sorts of stuff. Entertainment Weekly is another one. So at Time Inc., one of my main jobs was making headless WordPress work and pulling data out of WordPress, putting it in an intermediary database, because we had like 11 CMS in the company, and then pulling that data out of that normalized database to show on a website. So if you don't know what a decoupled or headless CMS is, that's totally okay. That's why we're here today. So a headless WordPress site, headless and decoupled are pretty interchangeable. Uses WordPress purely as a data source. There is a theme, because you always have to have a WordPress theme active with WordPress, but that's not what powers the front end of your website. For the most part, with a headless site, when someone visits your site, they are never touching your WordPress server. There's a lot of advantages to that. It makes it a lot more secure, potentially. Makes it much harder to hack your WordPress site, because there's very few avenues to actually get to it from your website. So we call it headless or decoupled because it's decoupled from the themes and plugins. Your front end is separate from your back end. So who here has heard of the term Jamstack? Awesome. Have you built any Jamstack sites? All right.
Yeah, no.
So Jamstack is probably the most common type of headless WordPress that's happening right now. Jamstack is a little different than some of the other stacks you might have heard of, like the lamp stack or the mean stack, because it's not actually specific to technologies other than JavaScript, but JavaScript is kind of a universal technology at this point, being baked into everything. So Jamstack is a headless approach to building a website using JavaScript, APIs, like perhaps the WordPress REST API or the WordPress GraphQL API that isn't a plugin, and then markup, whether that is coming from a markdown file, whether that is coming from markup in WordPress or another source. So there's no theme, and it is an API-driven front end. So let's just refresh a little bit. What does a typical WordPress site look like, and what does that relationship between a visitor and the server look like? So if I'm hitting a WordPress site, pretty typically, the user requests the site in the browser. Then the server receives that request, starts processing it. Right? It reads data out of the MySQL database. It reads your theme PHP files, plugin PHP files to start getting data, like templates and other logic it needs to render templates. And then it generates an HTML document. Then server sends the document over the wire. But a little bit more common WordPress setup looks like this. So user requests the site in the browser, but often if you're building a site at scale or even just trying to get more performance out of your site, you probably need some kind of full page cache solution. Nginx is a pretty common one that most WordPress hosts use. So first, I go to check the full page cache. Then, if the document isn't in there or it's expired, I go out to WordPress. And then WordPress has to go out to its object cache and database, other pieces, to create that document, populate the page cache, send it back over the wire. So, anyone here a Star Trek fan? Okay. So, part of the reason I'm making this joke is that in the show, they would separate the saucer section from the spaceship if they were like in a battle and they were trying to like protect like the civilians or something on the ship. And then they would have like the battle bridge, right? So one of the benefits of a headless setup is that you are doing this separation. and that you can make it much more secure because you're greatly reducing the surface area for attack. So a Jamstack WordPress setup looks a little different. So a user, for the most part, is always hitting flat files. They're hitting a rendered HTML document. And then once a Jamstack site loads, it turns itself into a single-page application. And so in addition to creating a static HTML file for a page, a Jamstack generator will also create a data file in either JSON or JavaScript. And it will also create a JavaScript file that has components that are needed to render that page. So that if I load up my first page on my home page, then I click over into a blog post, it's actually not reloading the page. It's using Ajax to pull in that data file and those component files that are needed to render out that blog post. Anything it had already pulled in for that home page, a global component, is already available. So the way Jamstack works typically is that if you publish a post in WordPress, or if you make a commit to a Git repo where your project, your front-end theme, effectively is living, that triggers your build service or server to spin up, start pulling data out of WordPress, start pulling any new files out of GitHub or your Git host, generating all of those flat files, and then pushing them to a CDN, typically an Edge CDN. And then the user is really only interacting with the CDN. They are not interacting with your WordPress site, unless you're trying to post data back into your WordPress site with a contact form or a store of some kind. The thing about Jamstack is that because we're sort of leaving the WordPress ecosystem, you really have to go most of the mile yourself. If you need to build a contact form that needs to talk back to WordPress, if you need to build a connection with your e-commerce store, maybe Easy Digital Downloads or WooCommerce, all of that is something you would have to build or find a solution for in the Jamstack ecosystem you're working in. So what does that Jamstack build typically look like? And we'll take a look at what one of these look like, a real live one, in a little bit. But what happens typically is that when I start triggering a Jamstack build, it is looking for files and template files that it needs to render those files. It's fetching source data. You'll often see source plugins. There's a source plugin for WordPress in Gatsby and Gridsome, which are the two most popular Jamstack generators. So we're going to get our data from WordPress. We're going to normalize, maybe change that data a little bit, and insert that source data into a GraphQL database. Who here has used GraphQL out of curiosity? Okay. GraphQL, long story short, is a query language that Facebook invented to make it easier to get data in and out of a database, as opposed to creating a REST endpoint. If you've made a lot of REST APIs or REST endpoints, you might know that once you have to start versioning those and iterating on those, it can get very painful. So GraphQL is really Facebook's answer that they came out with in 2015 to try to get around that problem. And so instead of hitting an endpoint that has very specific data, you can request your data exactly in the shape you want it and the keys you want it, and it will return a response to you. We'll take a look at that in a bit. But basically there is this middle database where I'm pulling from WordPress. I could also pull data from Shopify. I could pull data from any other REST API and pull it into that middle layer database. Then the Jamstack build is going to figure out from all of my data and files the routes that it should generate. So maybe I've said, here are my WordPress posts, and I want them to live at /post and then the slug. Maybe there is a flat file in my Jamstack site that I want to create an about page, because that's static. So I'm generating all my page routes, generating any dynamic routes. So I might have that about page that's static, but then I have that more dynamic URL that's that /post/slug that has to be generated from a template. Processing and compressing images. This is one of the places that Jamstack generators really shine above WordPress right now. The image tools that get used in this build service do compression in a way that is probably more efficient than most solutions out there for WordPress, like Smush, because these Jamstack generators use special components to load images into the page. So during this generation process, it's creating a small image, like a 20 pixel image, and then that kind of nice blur up that you see if you visit a Medium post or on Facebook. You see sort of a blurry version of an image, and then it sort of blurs into the actual image. Whenever you use an image in one of these Jamstack tools, it's first loading that small, tiny 20 pixel image. Then as the user scrolls in the browser, the intersection observer API in the browser is used to figure out, is this image in viewport or not? Once that image slides into the viewport, then it starts to Ajax in the larger image. So it creates just this really nice experience. Then write any global dependencies. So any of those global components that are needed, maybe a header bar, maybe a footer, something that's loaded on every route. And then per route, we're writing that fully generated static HTML file. We are rendering a flat data file that basically does a query against that GraphQL database we set up and pulls it into a file. Yeah?
You mentioned image compression, how it can viewport. Can you do a prefetch on anything that you want, that they're
Oh, sure. Yeah, so you could define a prefetch for any image. You could define prefetch for any domain that you want to have a pre-connect. So Jamstack is really all of the security, performance, and price benefits of flat files. It is fast. It is secure, because in an ideal world, the only thing on your server that your Jamstack site is being served from are the flat files. So the worst thing that could happen is that someone goes in and deletes your flat files, and then you just have to go click regenerate. It's really fast because it's flat files. You don't have to go out and do a database query. You're not even hitting a object cache. So it's really fast. Speed also translates into SEO ranking. When I converted my site from a WordPress site that was fairly optimized into a Jamstack site, I saw like a 20 or 40 fold increase in my SEO ranking. In price, it is pennies on the dollar to host a Jamstack site in comparison with a WordPress site. You could put those flat files out on Amazon S3. You could put them out in just a corner of your hosting right now in a WordPress account. And it's really, really cheap to host. You could do millions and billions of hits for maybe $100. So a single page application is something that came along in JavaScript within the past few years. Most of these Jamstack sites turn themselves into a single page application. If you've ever worked with one of these, they're a really nice developer experience. It's been a little bit challenging over the years to use a single page application to power your site, because the single page applications of the past have had to dynamically render every single time you hit a page, which is really tough on your search engine ranking. So what you used to have to do with a single page application is put it through a pre-render service that would go and crawl your site and create a copy of your site that's of that page that's fully rendered for Google. It was very expensive, and it also just doesn't feel fancy. It doesn't feel modern. You're basically making something really nice and then having to have a service go and crawl your site so that it was available for a search engine to find. So some common solutions that are used to create a Jamstack site. WP-GraphQL is a plugin I mentioned earlier. It is a free open source plugin. The lead developer was actually recently acquired to work on it full time by Gatsby. And it creates a GraphQL API on top of WordPress that you can use to power a Jamstack site or any other kind of headless relationship between your WordPress site and other systems and servers. So Gatsby and GridSum are effectively the same thing. Gatsby has been around longer. It has a larger plugin ecosystem. It has more resources and documentation available for it. GridSum is, it says on the site that they're trying to basically do Gatsby in Vue. So if you have written React code before, or if you've written Vue code before, you might have a preference. And if you haven't, Gatsby, all of the code in Gatsby looks like JavaScript. Your script obviously looks like JavaScript, but your styles are also written in JavaScript and not in CSS. And your markup is also written in JavaScript and JSX and not CSS. So if you're not a JavaScript developer, it might not be a very comfortable experience. GridSum is a little bit more of a traditional templating language. Your styles can be written in CSS or Sass or less, whatever your preference. Your script obviously looks like script, but your markup looks a little bit more like HTML than JSX does. So if you're thinking about dabbling in this, I would definitely recommend checking out GridSum. And so some common gotchas. One of the nice things about WordPress is that if you need a new feature, you just install a new plugin and then you can use it on your site. You need live data. If you need a plugin to power something, you have to build all of that. You might be able to use the plugin's API endpoints or data structure, but you probably have to do the work to run it all down. Internal links are a little bit challenging. So whenever I navigate a site, I'm going to pull one up real quick. So this is my site. This is built in GridSum. So you'll notice that if I navigate around, that it is pretty snappy. This is a live website out on the internet. This is not something on my local machine. And the reason it is so fast is that it uses an internal link component that looks and acts like an HTML anchor, but instead creates this dynamic routing to another page using Ajax. So it's sort of like clicking a button and creating something that does an Ajax change of all the markup on the page. Part of the reason you want to use that link component is that it uses the same intersection observer API that the images use when images are loaded. So anytime a link that's an internal link on my site comes into the viewport, the site actually dynamically loads all of the component files and all of the data files I need for that route, such that when I click on that link, that data is already available and it's almost instantaneous. But one of the challenges is if I'm creating a post in WordPress and I want to link to another post in my WordPress site, and I go into the WordPress editor, and I highlight some text or an image, and I make my link, that is a traditional anchor, and it is linking to where WordPress thinks that post lives on the WordPress domain. It is not aware of the internal link system, the domain, and the URL structure of my Jamstack site. So one of the downsides is you have to go through all of your content as you pull it out of WordPress and transform those links into the equivalent, they're called a G-link in both Gatsby and GridSum.
Is that just part of your build tools?
Sorry?
Is that just part of your build tools? Is that like
Yeah. So you could either do it on the WordPress side so that when you hit an API endpoint or a GraphQL endpoint to get that data out, that it's already transformed. That can be a little bit more performant if you're doing it at scale, but you could also do it during your build sequence. Same deal with inline images. If I upload an image into a WordPress post and then I insert it into a page, and then I pull that page as data into my Jamstack site, that image will show up, but the URL is still pointing at my WordPress server. So if I really want to get all of the benefits of that internal linking tool, I also have to go the extra mile of scanning for image links in my content, downloading those images to the local file system during the build, so that the build tool can process those images and create new copies of them. So You don't have to do that with images. I strongly recommend it with links. There are some plugins out there that make it a little bit easier because this is a problem a lot of WordPress developers have encountered as they've tried to build these. So I'll pull up a link in a little bit. There's a guy named Tyler Barnes who's done a lot of work with Gatsby and WordPress, and he has a plugin that will replace inline images and I believe links as well. Another common gotcha for the same reason as internal links is the WordPress menu system. Great tool. You can just quickly build out a hierarchical menu. But all of the links that get saved for a WordPress menu are internal to the WordPress site. That WordPress menu also isn't aware of any of the files that create a static page that are living in your GitHub repo. So if you have a static homepage file in your Jamstack template, or a static about page, whatever that page is, WordPress isn't necessarily aware of that page. So you could add it as a custom link, but it kind of reduces the value of some of these internal tools in WordPress. Again, with live data, plugins. If I want to add a contact form, that's great. I can say, add, contact form 7 or Ninja Forms, whatever that form system I like is. And then how do I get that data back into WordPress from my Jamstack site? You have to build authentication into your Jamstack site so that that data could either go through a Lambda function or post directly into your site. But that can be a little bit dangerous. One of the nice things we get when we render a WordPress theme is a nonce, a security nonce I can use to make requests against the WordPress REST API or other data. I can't generate a nonce in my Jamstack site because if I generated it a month ago, that nonce is stale. So you either need to regenerate frequently so that your front end has access to a live nonce, or come up with some other kind of authentication flow. So it's not trivial to make more than a static site using these tools. Another thing we really take for granted is WordPress previews. It's one of the sort of unsung heroes, I think, of WordPress that really gives users the confidence that the change they're about to make is going to work the way they think it is. So I go into a post, I make a change, and I hit preview. I then have the confidence to hit publish or update. There is still a WordPress theme with your Jamstack site, so you could theoretically build out a page template that looks like your Jamstack site. But again, we're piling on more work here for things that WordPress does out of the box. And finally, this is a little bit more relevant if you are working in the news industry, like I was a few years ago, which is that the builds take a few minutes. So if I have a breaking news story that I'm trying to publish on my news website, it might take 3 to 5 minutes to get that story published. And in modern times, that's a little bit too long. And as my site increases in size, that build increases exponentially. So if I have 10 posts, it might be a 2-minute build. If I have 10,000 posts, it could be a 20-minute build. So something else to keep in mind as you're building your site and as you're regenerating a site is how much data you have and how much time you have to wait for it to regenerate. So I have some resources here, and then I want to jump into some just live demos so that we can actually see what some of this stuff looks like. WP-GraphQL.com is where that GraphQL plugin lives. Gatsby.org, Gritsum.org. There are a number of, I guess 2 for the moment, WordPress themes that some contributors, including Jason, who builds WP-GraphQL, and Zach Gordon, have built over at Gatsby WP Themes. I think one of them is 2019, and another is Rich Tabor's Tabor theme for WordPress. So if you want to start building a Jamstack site, and you want something that is already going to be a little bit more compatible, maybe with some block CSS and other WordPress styles, there's those themes there. This course isn't out yet, but pretty soon Zach Gordon, who runs JavaScript for WP.com, is going to be launching a Headless WordPress course with Gatsby. I highly recommend his courses if you're new to JavaScript, or particularly with Gutenberg. He has some really great courses for using JavaScript with WordPress.
What was his name?
Zach Gordon. All right. So want to just take a quick peek at this site. This is my site. Again, I have a blog post here. This blog post is in my WordPress site. I have an about page, a contact page. It's a pretty basic site. So this is the repository for that site. Oh, I have security vulnerabilities I get to squash. That's fun. So with both Gatsby and Gridsome, you often have a configuration file in the root of your directory. That config handles some of these sort of global settings you would probably store in WordPress settings typically. You can set this data manually here, or you could pull in data into your GraphQL layer and access that to dynamically populate this. So if you want the site name to be pulled in from the WordPress site name option, you can do that. I just have it hard-coded here. And then you can tap into the Webpack build if you want to add on anything to your Webpack build. There is a plugin here I'm using to add my Google Analytics ID. A source plugin that pulls in photos from my Instagram. A plugin that builds a plugin sitemap for me. Again, things I would probably install a WordPress plugin for that I have to find some other resource for. The Gridsome plugin ecosystem is a lot younger. There aren't solutions for AMP yet. There's a few solutions out there for RSS feeds. But again, a lot of things that we sort of take for granted that WordPress just does for us that we can grab, we have to think about a little bit differently in a Jamstack setup. So I have this config file here. And then I have this server file. This is what's used during the build process. So who here's written JavaScript? Just get a read on their own. Cool. So here I make a request to a WordPress URL. This process.env item is pulling server variables, environment variables from my server, because I don't want to hard code these. So I take a look at my build tool here. It's called Netlify. I have these environment variables where I have a token, I have some base URLs, some other details that I can access then using these process variables. Is this big enough? No, it's not. So I pass an authorization token over the wire to my WordPress site. This is actually just hitting the WordPress REST API to get some feed data from meetup.com, and a few other data feeds from GitHub. I see this requesting data received. We'll see that in the log in a minute for my build. I set up some content types in my store for meetup.com events, for my GitHub repos, the GitHub repos I've starred, pulling those all out of the GitHub API. And then I just loop over these items. I'm inserting my meetups. So for each item in my meetups, add a node to the database with the item using the spread operator. Same thing with the GitHub repos, same thing with stars. And then here, this is what a GraphQL request would look like. I'm doing a post request to a URL. And then in the query body, I have this string that kind of looks like JSON, but lacks some quotes, lacks colons, and just has a slightly different syntax. One of the great things about GraphQL is it's actually very easy to use and learn because it uses what is called an introspection query to power the query. So here I have that URL for my content site where I want to pull the posts out of my database. If I run this query, I can see the data, the title, the slug, the content string for all of my content to insert, as well as some other data about the categories, the date, the featured image. If I wanted to pull more data out of this, I could hit return and make a new line. And then as I start typing, it's going to automatically populate the fields that I can pull in. So I don't need to remember the keys for everything. And if I don't want to just type, it also automatically builds documentation for all of the objects I'm trying to work with. So if I want to take a look at what available items I have for posts, I could come in here and take a look at a post and see all of the relationships and data that I could pull out there. So if I wanted to get the edit last here, I could say edit last. And then when I run that query again, it gives me an error. It's also giving me a nice red line here, so what are my keys here? So edit last, I would say the name of that user, and then this is the user, my content API user on my WordPress site that edited that post last. So GraphQL is a really nice tool to work with if you haven't used it before or you're considering building REST API endpoints for something. I definitely recommend checking it out. So basically, I do some queries up here for some feeds on my site. I query for my post data and some other event data that powers this activity page, shows some of my current events. I guess it's broken because I'm here at Omaha. But basically, build some nice little timelines showing some of the events. Here's my Instagram photos that I was pulling in before. So here's how I start getting some of that data. But then, I also need to do something with that data. So GridSum in particular is a very specific directory structure. It's pretty opinionated. I like the opinions. Gatsby's a little bit more agnostic. But there's this really nice page in the GridSum docs that explains all the different files, that config file, the server file, everything that should be in your package JSON to get all of the modules you need. The source directory is where most of your templates will live. So if I take a look at my source directory here, I have a components folder, a fonts folder, some images, some layouts, some static pages, some Sass styles in here, SVGs, and some other templates. So if I take a look at my main JS file here, I can see I'm importing some of those styles. I'm importing some other JavaScript components here from my components folder. And then I'm also using some NPM packages like the datefns library and VueMQ. And then if you've used Vue before, this probably looks pretty familiar. I'm just registering those components with Vue and then creating some filters I can use in my templates so that I can just capitalize a string very quickly or lowercase a string very quickly, figure out the distance between dates so that I can say is 1 day ago on that activity page. Setting up Vue, I'm pushing some metadata into my head. So I'm adding a description, some robots data, to Googlebot, setting up the theme color so that Chrome and other tools can pull in my theme color, brand to browser. I'm adding some structured data here. It's something that Yoast would probably do for me, but again, I have to go out and build. So I'm adding a script object that has a JSON string in here with some details about me so that I can be found on Google. So that's the main file. But if I start taking a look at my pages, for example, in here I have a 404 page. And here's where things are probably going to start looking a little bit more familiar if you've developed WordPress themes or you work in HTML. In a Vue document, there are 3 sections in one file. There is a template section at the top, then a style section, and then a script. I don't have any specific styles in here, but one of the nice things about that, it's called a single file component, is that I'm not context switching a lot between files. So I'm not trying to remember where's the JavaScript that powers this template. Where is the style sheet that powers this template? And it puts it all in one file so that I could either just work and scroll up and down in my file, or I could split my editor so that I'm looking at the same file in different places. And it really just reduces that like jumping between files issue. Where did I leave that thing? So pretty simple for a 4 page. Then I have my index page here. I pull in some components that handle my intro, my work history. These are all pretty plain at the moment. If I take a look at some of those components, one of those partials may be the index intro. So this is all the HTML markup. Hey there, I'm Dave, the Bluehost logo, WordCamp Phoenix logo, which I helped organize, Tempe, Arizona logo, where I live, and a little bit more data about me that looks just like that. Then I have a style tag right below that that's doing some specific styles just for this component. And one of the really nice features of Vue is this scoped property. This is not something that works in your browser. You cannot say style, CSS scoped in your browser. But when Vue reads this component file and renders it, it adds a data attribute that is unique to all of the elements in this component. So that in this style tag, if I wanted to, I could target just anchors. I could say, A bracket, color red. And instead of changing the anchors on my entire page, it is just affecting the anchors in this component. So it makes it a lot easier to write CSS. You don't have to be as specific, and you can be a little bit lazier with the cascade. So I do some very specific styles for this component. I import some SVGs, which I can just use directly as a component. If you haven't seen this syntax before, you can see it with like image tags in HTML, but you don't need to always have an opening and closing tag. I can just have a closing tag after I imported that component. And then I just have to export those components that are also used within this template. Then I have an author box. This is at the bottom of my blog post. I use the G image tag here. That's that image tag I would use instead of the IMG tag. And I point it to a local source on my file system. And if I go into my src img, I have a Dave Ryan small file in there that gets pulled in, gets processed, creates that 20 pixel image as well as the full one. And I realized I only have like one bitmap on this entire site right now, but if you take a look there, you can kind of see it blurs in nicely. And if I had a large background image, that would be a huge savings as I load the page. So, in addition to my source directory, there's a few other pieces to this. I can have some data in here. I can have some other static assets in here. And then to use this, this is a local copy of that repository. I could take a look at my package JSON. Zoom in here. Yeah. So my package JSON has some dependencies that I use on the front end from GridSum. Pulls in Bufi, which is a system that wraps Bulma, which is very similar to Bootstrap, but in some Vue components. I am pulling in some other Bulma extensions that create that timeline I wanted, a little ribbon style tooltips. I pull in GridSum itself. Lodash. Locutus is one of my favorite little projects out there. It's, again, a Star Trek joke. The idea is that JavaScript is assimilating all the other languages. So if you're a PHP developer and you're really comfortable writing PHP, and all of a sudden you have to work with an array in JavaScript and you don't have access to all of your really nice PHP array functions, well, someone's written them in JavaScript to work the same way those functions work in PHP. So if you're trying to sort of get a quick jump start on this, you're not that comfortable with JavaScript, check out Locutus. And when you need to do a string replace, when you need to do an array function, something that PHP is really good at and JavaScript is not as good at, you can pull in that function and use it. It's also translated into a bunch of other languages. So if you use Go, if you use Python, if you're familiar with other programming languages, you can pull in the equivalent functions in all of those languages in JavaScript. So really powerful tool to get a quick jump start on writing some code.
Is that framework agnostic then? Is that React and Vue?
Yeah. Oh yeah. You could use it in Gatsby. You could use it in Gridsome. You can use it in any kind of JavaScript site. So, Sharp is the image processing library that does all of that really nice compression for us. And then I'm pulling in Vue, a few other dependencies. Also have some dev dependencies that are only used during the build process. They're not used on the front end. So the Gridsome CLI, the Gridsome source plugin that lets me read my file system, pull in markdown files or JSON files, put them, into that GraphQL database. Some common tags, Node Sass, some things that if you're using JavaScript, you've probably used before in some kind of site. And if I come in here and I run npm, Gridsome develop, we're going to see some of those console logs I saw in my server file before. So it's initializing the plugins, it's requesting data, data received, it's inserting my meetups, it's inserting my repos, my stars, requesting posts in my about page, loading. And there we go. Now, if I click this local host URL, that same site I had up there, I can work on here. And one of the really nice features of both Gridsome and Gatsby is they use what's called hot module reloading. For some reason, I can't see. There we go. So I CD again into that project. I run npm develop. Actually, first open up the code of the project. Run Gridsome develop. Go through that same sequence. Then, if I come in here to my source files, I want to make a change. Go into my main CSS file. Maybe instead of a deep red color, I want it to be yellow. Come in here, add a nice gold yellow color, hit save. Of course, it doesn't work. Basically, as I make a change in my file, I actually don't even need to reload my browser. It carries over into the browser. So for example, if I'm working on a drop-down menu that is triggered by a user clicking, a hamburger icon, and I'm trying to style something, and I'm trying to, make a change in my Sass, and then go look in the browser, instead of having to go and refresh my browser and re-click the hamburger so I can see it and see if my change actually was successful, it just carries over after I save the file. Of course, it doesn't work in the live demo, but that's how live demos go.
You mean the hamburger menu would be open with your changes style?
Mm-hmm. So it's not something that's working right now in the Gutenberg development environment, but hot module reloading isn't unique to Vue. It's something React, lots of JavaScript ecosystems use. And so eventually, when you're working or trying to contribute to Gutenberg, and maybe you're trying to work on that main menu in Gutenberg, or you're trying to work on a block, and there's a very specific component, and you've tabbed into something on the sidebar, you don't have to re-go through that process every single time you make a change in your template files, or your style files, or your script. It just immediately carries over into the browser. So it's a really nice developer experience. A lot less reloading, a lot more make a change, see it works, move on. So when I pull up this site here, it gives me that local URL, and then it also says explore GraphQL data at this place. If I click in here to explore, it creates a really nice little environment where I can look all of the different data that's in my site, in that GraphQL database, that middle layer. So I can come over here into the docs that automatically get generated, and if I want to see all of the keys I have available to work on with an Instagram photo, I can take a look here. I can find the timestamp, taking that timestamp, dimensions, display URL, thumbnail, if it's a video or not on Instagram. I can take a look at my WordPress posts here, and I can see I have my title, slug, date, content. If I wanted to start writing a query to get some data in a component, I can say query, and it's going to auto-complete for me again. Then I want to get my WordPress posts. I want to get my title, excerpt ID. I hit play here. I don't have any WordPress posts in here. How about pages? Live demos are really fun. But the point being that when you actually query your data, whew, that's a tough contrast, isn't it? Feel free to stop me as I'm going if you can't see these things. Yikes. I don't know if there's another color scheme I can turn on here. Alright, well, I get this nice query area. I can build my queries in this tool, and then I can just copy my query. And then as I need that query in a page, if I come over here to my index page, I can see that I also have this page query tab right below my template. And I just query for all my WordPress posts. I get my title, my date, my ID. And then if I need to make a change to this query, I can copy this string here, right? Bring it over again here, paste, add any of the new tags I want. Check my query actually works right here. Just copy it right back. Then I have access to that data. In my template here, this is where we start looking at this is a little bit more specific to Vue. There's a different way you would do this in Gatsby. You would map and loop over an array that way. But here I have this nice V4 tag that I can use in Vue. V is for Vue. And I can look in the $page, which is my page query. Look in my all WordPress posts. Look in what are called the edges. Whenever you loop over something in React or Vue, you have to assign a key to each item you're looping over. So I assign a key from the node ID, and then I just put my node title inside my link there, and that's how I would start playing with some data in the site. So, how are we all doing? Yeah? So, why would I do this? Sounds like it's a lot of extra work. It's a lot of extra work outside of WordPress. What are the benefits? Definitely speed, definitely security, definitely performance. But it also lets you perhaps bring different people into a project than you normally could. Instead of having to find someone who knows WordPress really well, you can find a JavaScript developer and say, hey, we just have to work with some data sourced from an API. And so it's a way that you can broaden the team that you hire or work with. It's a way to skill up and start working in a different space. One of the really nice things about GraphQL I didn't show off yet is, let's say I have an old template in WordPress, and the key it uses is called the title. I can rekey that data on the fly, and then instead of asking for the title, I can ask for the title. So if you're working with legacy templates, if you're working with a site that has data in Drupal, maybe something over here, and maybe they have a Shopify, this is a really great solution. Instead of having to port all of that stuff to WordPress, you can keep them where they are, query for old posts, and then query for new posts in WordPress. So If you have an existing site, does it make sense to just jump in and completely rebuild it as a headless site? Depends. Maybe if that speed increase and security and performance increase is really worth it to you, that might make sense. But definitely consider this if you have a project that comes up where it's like, oh gosh, I don't want to port something from Drupal into WordPress. As long as the Drupal site is secure and it's being updated, maybe you're running it on a managed Drupal host. What?
I wish the ones I've interacted with were.
Right.
The ones I've interacted with are version 6.
Oh boy.
And 7 or something like that.
So we have Gatsby and Rhythm, which are React and Vue based. We have the WP-GraphQL plugin, which lets us talk to WordPress using GraphQL as opposed to requesting a REST endpoint. We can build all of our templates in our front-end system and pull from tons of different data sources. So it gives us a lot of flexibility, really nice developer experience, and at the end of the day, the site is really fast.
It's 10 till,
Yeah.
so you know the time.
Yeah, I'm just wrapping up. So definitely check it out. Definitely check out Zach Gordon's course once it comes out if you're curious to explore it more. I am Dave Ryan on GitHub and Twitter. The D is 0. So if you have any questions, I have, I think, a few minutes here for questions, but I'll also be out at the Happiness Bar after this. Yeah?
So if I have so it seems like the best, you're not working on like huge time.com, or whatever kind of.
This isn't, yes.
This is not really one of your probably tool sets you're going to go for.
No.
Unless you have a really simple site, like brochure content
Right.
with small amount of pages, just want to make lightning fast.
Right.
So if I was going to do that, say I have one of those sites existing, and I picked Gatsby or whatever, and I have developers familiar with that environment and JavaScript and whatnot, what would be the guess at the amount of time it would take to actually like take an existing just plain old WordPress site like that and get it running in an environment like this? Are we talking like days, or are we talking like weeks?
It's always going to vary by the person a little bit.
Right, but I mean, assuming that they're a fairly common developers.
I don't think it's a super hard ask because it's really looking at the single PHP or post template in your WordPress site, copying that into one of these templates, and then swapping out the PHP that is pulling data from the database with JavaScript keys and loops for that same data. So I wouldn't say it's trivial, but it's. I don't think it's not doable.
Aside from converting all of the markup to Vue.js or whatever and all that kind of stuff, get that out of the way. Most of the other stuff just comes natively in the environment. Is that true? Or is it mostly just translation from?
It's mostly just translation from PHP to JavaScript, and then dealing with any of those sort of gotchas. Are there inline links in the content that need to be transformed? Are there images that you want to transform and use that image processing? You don't have to with the images. You could leave the images on your WordPress site, turn on Cloudflare on that server, and then, again, that request for the image is never going to get to your server only the first time, right? So, yeah.
This may be kind of a left field question, but so when you said when you worked for Time Inc., you had a lot of different sources that you built in. Were any of those .NET, and have you heard or know of any use cases with this where people have pulled in .NET sources as well?
Some of those were .NET. I do not know .NET. I have no desire to know .NET. As long as there is a way to query your the database that environment is
so
in.
So if there's an API out of the .NET environment, you could easily tie this in as well.
If any REST API, you could pull data into this site. You could pull from GitHub, you could pull from Yelp, you could pull from Google APIs, really anywhere. There are some source plugins out there for Gatsby that let you power all your content from a Google spreadsheet. And one of the really cool things about that is you could have multiple people in a Google spreadsheet with their cursors being seen, working on a site at the same time. That's something WordPress isn't as good at. So you might decide that you only want to use WordPress to power your posts and your pages, and then other data that you need, you don't want to add settings, APIs to WordPress, or meta fields. Those event activities I actually use ACF. The last thing I'll show here. Oh, that's great. Keyboard's not working. So, I log into my WordPress site that is powering that site. Find my cursor towards these activities. So if I take a look at WordCamp Omaha, I've created a bunch of GraphQL fields here, ACF fields, and then there is a GraphQL with ACF plugin for the WP-GraphQL API. That's how I access all of this data. And then if I have my venue name, my date line, I can set a location, talk type, a few other details, and that's what I use to power that activity page. So, pulls in those different pieces, renders in the template. So, if you want to create an interface for someone to create a very specific style of object, ACF is a great option, whatever MetaBox API you like in WordPress, and then you can just work with those keys however you'd like once they're in the GraphQL database. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. I want to say thank you again to all the organizers and volunteers that have made WordCamp Omaha happen. It's been a lot of fun being with you all, and I'll be out at the Happiness Bar afterwards if you have any other questions.
Good.